Well, good morning, everybody. It's a privilege for me to be here. As Don said, my name's Henry Smith. I'm with the Associates for Biblical Research, and my presentation this morning is on the issue of the primeval chronology, the so-called primeval chronology in Genesis 5 and 11. My interest in this subject goes back about 15 years, but back at that time, I was a relatively new Christian and had no formal Bible training of any kind. I didn't know Greek or Hebrew or anything, but I was interested in the subject. But I vacillated continuously on how to interpret these passages because I didn't have enough knowledge of the subject. And then in the last few years, we began a project with the Ministry of ABR related to this subject. And the last 2 years, I've been able to spend some time on it rather intensely. And so the project continues. We ask for your prayers for that. And we're hoping that I'll be able to publish a book, hopefully in 2019, called From Adam to Abraham. And in that, I'm going to make the case that for the Septuagint's preservation of the original numbers from the text of Scripture. So I'm going to tell you up front my perspective, what sort of conclusion I've reached here. Sometimes you wait for the conclusion at the end. I'm going to tell you up front, and then we'll walk through some of the reasons why I've kind of drawn that conclusion. So we ask for your prayers for that, and you'll find a handout that Scott's going to hand out now, just with the list of some articles that have been published and are in the process of going to be published. If this subject interests you, the handout has a list of them, and then there's one article as well that was published in Bible and Spade. The second article that I co-authored with Jeremy Sexton. So these are some important articles, recent ones, hopefully important on the subject. And then these are some upcoming ones. Again, I ask for your prayers for this. I'll be presenting at the Conference on Creationism in Pittsburgh, and then a couple of other articles. A new one in Bible and Spade on some unique problems in Genesis 5. So hopefully, excuse me, I have a cold, so bear with me. We'll see some success with some of these articles, and if you want to see the updates, they're on the ABR website. So that's my commercial. So we're going to jump right into this question of Genesis 5 and 11. If you read through it, it's the famous begat passages. So-and-so begat so-and-so, and he was this many years old, and he lived this many years afterward, and he lived this many years, and he died. And so there's two main thrusts of the research project. The first is to what I believe is appropriate in terms of the text, is to reestablish the chronological interpretation as what I believe is the correct interpretation, to go carefully and thoughtfully through the texts. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those texts today, show you some of the syntax and why I believe that's the correct way to interpret the text of Genesis 5 and 11. Now, if you look at the history of interpretation on this subject, you'll see that the view on it was unanimous, which is rather unusual when you think about, you come to a conference like this, and you think about all the disparate disagreements and viewpoints about every subject that you can imagine. But when you look at the history of the interpretation of Genesis 5 and 11, you have thousands of years of a unanimous consensus that the text yielded a chronology across a vast geographic spectrum, an ideological spectrum, a theological spectrum. So whether it was Jewish historiography, Christian fathers, pseudepigrapha, you name it, everybody saw it as yielding a chronology. And that's an important consideration when we weigh the subject. It doesn't tell us that means it's correct, but in terms of the history of the church and the history of interpretation, it is important for us to evaluate the past, how those in the past have interpreted the text of Scripture. But in the late 1800s, along came William Henry Green of old Princeton, and he published an article where this term primeval chronology comes from, the chronology before the time of Abraham. And he advocated a non-chronological interpretation. His argument was that there were gaps in the chronology of Genesis 5 and 11. And so, thus, you could not calculate a chronology from Adam to the flood, and from the flood to Abraham. It was an open-ended period of time. And B.B. Warfield picked up on that and said, this could be stretched to 200,000 years. Whatever time the scientists need to accommodate this time period, it accommodates it because it's not necessarily an interlocking chronology. And so Green's article was sort of obscure for quite a while, but in the mid 20th century, it began to supplant the old view and eventually reached the consensus in conservative scholarship. You read through conservative literature, commentaries, articles. This is the majority viewpoint now, that that the chronology is not, there's not a chronology and there's gaps. And so therefore it can accommodate, in terms of archaeology and history, longer periods of time. You'll inevitably read that in the conservative literature. So there's much to say about this, and hopefully in the book I'll be expanding on it in great detail. But the fundamental argument that Green made that you have to look for when you read the literature is his conflation of genealogical versus chronological gaps. This is the fundamental point. In his article, Green pointed out a lot of places in Scripture as analogies where you have gaps in the genealogies. Classic examples are Ezra, Matthew, Exodus 6, and Ruth 4. Matthew 1 is the classic example, right? It's a constructed genealogy of 14 folks going back to the time of going back to the genealogy of Jesus. There's names missing. It's obvious from that. That's the purpose of Matthew's intent, is to create a structure, a genealogical structure, as he's writing it. And so Green used these examples to try to argue that in Genesis 5 and 11 it's the same phenomenon. There's a genealogical gap. And so this is the viewpoint that has sort of held sway. But the problem with this approach is it conflates the idea of a genealogical and a chronological gap. So just because there's names missing in a genealogy doesn't mean, if Scripture gives us data, that we don't have a chronological intent, and it doesn't necessitate a chronological gap. I'm going to show you that here in just a few moments. So let's take a look a little bit at the grammar of the text. This is very typical of through the genealogies. It's a very repetitive. It's very repetitive in the syntax and the grammar and the literary structure all throughout the two genealogies. So here we have the example of Jared. So Jared, when he had lived 162 years, he brought forth his son, right? He brought forth Enoch. Now you'll see a couple of things here in the Hebrew text. The first it's very important, is the Hebrew verb yalad is used here. This is in the Hifil form, and that's causative. Now the reason why the author has written this way is because the obvious causative role that the father plays in the birth of his descendant, right? It's obviously the woman is the one who physically gives birth. So it makes sense that he uses the causative form. It appears 55 times in Genesis 5 and 11, all throughout. And so you have this relationship between Jared at this particular time, Yalad, right? He brings forth, or he caused to be born. That's how the text appeals. That's what the Hifil is. It's a causative form, and the direct object is Enoch. You see that? So the one who is the recipient of the action in the 162nd year of Jared's life. So it's very precise the way the genealogy is written, the syntax. And now this is the Masoretes added the makef to make sure that you understood that it's Enoch and not somebody else who's the recipient of the action, who's participating in the activity. That's how the Hifil works. So it's very precise the way that it's written, syntactically. And then if you go on, the next part of the formulaic way that this is repeated is it expresses how the individual patriarch lived, how many years after he brought forth this particular patriarch. And the pattern is patriarch A, so you have Jared, Enoch, Mahalalel, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, for example, all the way through. And the way it's written, again, is the Hifil, but this time it's in the infinitive form. So you have after and it's in construct infinitive. Yalad, again, Hifil of Yalad. So after he caused him to be born, he lived 800 years. So it's very precise syntactically the way that it's written. And again, then the Hifil of Yalad is used again to express that he had other sons and daughters. Doesn't tell us anything about them, doesn't tell us their names, doesn't tell us when they were born, but nonetheless, it expresses this relationship that Jared is the one who caused this other person to come forth in this particular year of his life. This makes Genesis 5 and 11 different than all of the other genealogies. Very different. Because most of the other ones, if they have numbers, they'll just usually talk about the lifespan, if they have any numbers at all. They do not contain the begetting age, by and large, and they don't contain this formula with the remaining years. So this is what makes Genesis 5 and 11 unique, and I think this is where Green was in error in conflating the other genealogies with this. This syntax is very precise in the way that it's written. And again, if you look through it in the Hebrew and in the Greek, you'll see how the kind of precision that it's written in. So now here's a very important point that's related to this issue of genealogical relationship, and that is, depending on the information that Scripture gives us, the Hifil can point to either an immediate son. So in the case of Adam, Adam begat Seth. We know that Seth is Adam's direct son. We know that from other data in Scripture. But it also can point to a remote ancestor. So it could be a grandson, a great-grandson, a great-great-grandson. The context will tell us, or other data from Scripture will tell us what that relationship is. But here's the rub, or here's the key point that has often been missed in the literature. In theory, when we say that Jared, Yalad, Enoch, he could be his grandson. He could be his great-grandson. He could be his great-great-grandson. It doesn't matter what the relationship is genealogically, because his life is interlocked in the 162nd year. So in that year of Jared's life, Enoch is born. It doesn't matter if Enoch is his son or his grandson or his great-grandson. And that's the key point in understanding the syntax of Genesis 5 and 11. In my view, we have no other data from Scripture to tell us if Enoch is definitely Jared's direct son or if he's a remote descendant. But in terms of chronology, it doesn't matter, because the syntax interlocks the relationship. And so this is a critical point, and you'll read in the literature over and over folks who will argue for the gap view will say Yalad can refer to a remote descendant. Yalad can refer to a remote descendant. And that's true. There's no question that that's the case. And Ruth 4 in particular, you'll see if you read through Ruth 4, it uses the Hifil of Yalad, and it's not always a direct father-son relationship. But Ruth 4 has no numerical data. It doesn't give begetting ages. It doesn't give lifespans. It doesn't give any of that data. It just says so-and-so begat so-and-so. You have to figure out what that relationship is. But in Genesis 5 and 11, it's quite different. And so this is the key, in my view, in arguing how do you interpret this. I have found that it's just impossible to get out from underneath the force of the syntax. And so I've concluded through the research that the chronological interpretation is what makes sense, because that's what the syntax leads me to believe. So I submit that for your consideration. As you consider this, and perhaps you've held to the gap view or heard the gap view, you got to look closely at the syntax as you wrestle with the issue of chronology in these two genealogies. So again, the relationship between Jared and Enoch is irrelevant as it relates to chronology. Green conflated genealogical and chronological gaps, and this is a fundamental point that you should come away with as you analyze this particular question. Now, a couple articles, that are important. Jeremy Sexton's article in the Westminster Journal, which is on the ABR website, deals with the syntax in great detail. And then he's going to be publishing, him and I have become friends through this project in the providence of God. And then he'll be publishing another article in Jets, hopefully coming up next year, following up on that and going through the syntax in great detail. And so I submit that for your consideration as you weigh this. So now that's the first thrust of the research, is to look at the syntax and the interpretation of the text, the numbers, and all that. So now the second question is, what do we do with the numerical divergences that are in the three witnesses? So you have three witnesses to the text. You have the Masoretic Text, you have the Septuagint, and you have the Samaritan Pentateuch. Three witnesses, and they have numerical divergences in them. The numbers diverge. And therefore, when you calculate a chronology, each one yields a different chronology. So the obvious question to us is, how do we determine which is the original? Where does the evidence lead? And so what I've been trying to do in the research is try to present a historically grounded, viable theory that can adequately explain the large-scale alterations to the numbers. In fact, these divergences are further evidence of chronological intent. The reason the numbers have been changed in some of the manuscripts is because the ancients interpreted chronologically. See that? So the fact that the numbers have been altered is evidence of ancients saying, we believe this yields a chronology when we interpret it. So here's just a chart, a lot of numbers coming at you. You'll see this you can go to the ABR website to pull up this article that I wrote on the subject. But as you look through the numbers, you can see there are divergences, and we'll talk about a couple of those in just a few moments. Here's a summary of what you get when you go through and you add up the numbers. The Masoretic Text, bless you. The Masoretic Text gives you about 1,656 years from the Adam to the flood. Then you have the post-flood period for a total of about 2,000. You'll see the Samaritan Pentateuch, even though the total is close to the Masoretic, the two epochs are quite different in terms of the time period. And then in the Septuagint, you have even other divergences in the numbers. So my colleague Scott Stripling told me a year and a half ago, when I started really getting into this, that you've treaded out into very deep waters. And he's very correct about that. It's not just deep waters. The subject has been an abyss of research. But it's been very rewarding to try to see if could try to figure out what happened in these witnesses to the text. So I'm going to give you some outline of what I think are good arguments, hopefully, for your consideration. First is just from a broad standpoint, there's been a couple of different approaches. The liberal critical scholarship has tried to figure this out in more depth than conservative scholarship. But their theories about the origin of the Old Testament end up leading to conclusions for those of us who have a high view of Scripture. It just it's not compatible with the Orthodox view. So here's Ronald Hendel's perspective. He says that the problems in Genesis 5 and 11 are accounted for by the theory that a redactor incorporated the book of the generations of Adam into a pre-existing text. So the idea is, there's these pieces of Genesis floating around out there, and somebody brought it all together at the end, and it created chronological errors. So it's a human work, and the errors are there, and then the people came along later to try to fix it. That's fundamentally what Hendel's arguing. Of course, we would approach it differently from an Orthodox standpoint, that the original numbers are correct, but they've become garbled in history, and we want to try to reconstruct them. They've been preserved by the Lord through history. That's the perspective that I'm taking. So we have two phenomenon in Genesis 5 and 11. We have large-scale deliberate alterations. There's no question that the numbers have been changed, mostly on the order of 100 in the beginning ages. So the question is, from a theoretical standpoint, have they been inflated or have they been deflated? And then there's some scribal errors that you find in the manuscript, particularly in the Septuagint. And those are pretty easily identified, and you can explain the reasons for those scribal errors relatively easily. So just to give you a couple examples, going back to our chart, you'll see, for example, how The begetting ages, take a look at Adam up here for the Masoretic and the Samaritan Pentateuch, they match. But the Septuagint is 100 years longer. All right? Then you move down through the history, you go in the Samaritan Pentateuch, now the numbers have changed when you get down to Jared, Methuselah, and Lamech. These numbers all match the book of Jubilees, but they diverge from the other two witnesses. Okay? So you can see this all has to be worked out, try to figure out how to explain how these phenomena have occurred in the biblical manuscripts. Why have they been deliberately changed in this particular way? So those are examples. We have the unique problem with Lamech. All the numbers are different. The ages, the lifespan, the remaining years. But then we also have consistencies that show us this goes back to one textual tradition. The lifespans are quite consistent in the early part of the pre-flood period across all three witnesses. Noah's numbers are all the same, and the same with Shem, all the way across three witnesses. The phrase 2 years after the flood in Genesis 11:10 is found in all three witnesses. And in many external witnesses, these numbers are also found, particularly Noah's numbers. So it's clear that whoever decided to change some of the numbers left these numbers alone. All right? And as you go down through the period, now you go to the post-flood period, and now the beginning ages match better between the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint. You have the unique issue of Canaan, which is a doctoral thesis in and of itself, to be honest with you, and then these matching numbers between the two witnesses. So you have a lot going on here. There's a lot to try to unpack, to figure out, of trying to restore the original numbers. As I said, the liberal scholarship has just thrown up its hands and said, you can't fix it. And conservatives generally just haven't done anything with it, because if the non-chronological interpretation is true, then the numbers aren't really that important anymore. Trying to figure out the begetting ages, it doesn't matter, because if it doesn't yield a chronology, it doesn't really impact archaeology, it doesn't impact apologetics, it doesn't matter. So you don't see a lot of attempts in the conservative literature to try to figure out this problem. So that's my take on that as far as trying to reconstruct the numbers. So you can see the task is rather large. So I'm going to give you an overview. I decided that I would just summarize what I call the Septuagint inflation hypothesis. So this is the idea that the Masoretic retains the original numbers and the Septuagint has been deliberately inflated. So that's what I call it. And there's a number of different theories in the literature to express why people think that the Septuagint translators inflated the chronology. So I'm going to show you reasons why I think this hypothesis fails. I have about 9 reasons listed, and that's coming up in my CRSQ article. I'm just going to give you a couple here today. One is that there's no ancient witnesses that support it. The earliest I've been able to trace the idea is back to 1834. So you don't have anybody from antiquity saying that this is what happened to the Greek text, that the translators inflated the chronology. The other is, the claim is usually that the Septuagint translators inflated the chronology because they wanted to match Egyptian chronology. You'll find that in many sources. I found that in at least 25 different sources that say that that's what happened. The problem with that is as Paul Ray says here, it's inadequate. The Septuagint chronology is not long enough to match Manetho's chronology or other ancient Egyptian chronologies. And so it doesn't achieve the alleged apologetic goal that it supposedly was done for. And another reason comes from Old Testament and Septuagint scholarship that they maintain by and large that the numbers that are in the Septuagint came from the Hebrew text. They were not invented by the author or the translators, but they come from the Hebrew text. And here we have probably one of the quintessential experts on the subject of, Dead Sea Scrolls and so on. And he says, although the Septuagint's been translated into Greek, the numbers should not be ascribed to the translator, but the Hebrew Vorlage, the text behind the Septuagint translation. They did not recalculate the lists, and so on. his view is it's highly unlikely that it's the Septuagint translators that change the numbers. And then to compound that problem for the hypothesis is the fact that the higher numbers in Genesis 11 in the Samaritan Pentateuch. So if the Septuagint translators inflated the chronology, one has to explain, well, why did the Samaritans inflate only the post-flood chronology? Because they wanted to match Egyptian chronology. That argument doesn't really hold very well. These are two independent sources that have the higher numbers in the post-flood period. So it really falls apart, the idea. And again, it shows that they don't that the numbers in Genesis 11, they match the begetting ages, and therefore it just can't explain, the theory can't explain that. And again, I'll show you the numbers really from Shem all the way down through, with the exception of Canaan, which is a unique problem. The begetting ages match all the way down until the time of Nahor. So the inflation hypothesis just doesn't work for the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now I'm going to just talk about two other pieces of evidence that I believe point to deflation, meaning the Masoretic has been deflated, and not inflation, meaning that the Septuagint has not been deliberately inflated. And so these are going to be spelled out in a couple of these articles. The one is a handout, the Bible in Spade, has very brief overview, and then hopefully my CRSQ article coming up in the spring will explain this further. But let me give you a couple of arguments. So we got internal evidence, which I'm going to talk about, and then external evidence. So external evidence is referring to authors that refer to Genesis 5 and 11 in antiquity, and they record the numbers, Josephus being a classic example. What kind of text did he have in front of him, and what numbers did he have? And this gives you a snapshot into the state of the Genesis text in that particular time period. So these external witnesses help us to try to reconstruct what happened in the manuscripts. I believe this is a critical part of the investigation, that the manuscript evidence alone is not sufficient. It tells us a lot, and usually in text criticism it's sufficient in and of itself, but this unique case, we need this external evidence to help us put it together. So I'm going to give you two sources that I've found in my research that I think support the longer chronology. The first is this sort of obscure witness it's called Lab. It's from the pseudepigrapha, and it chronicles biblical history from Adam to Saul. Okay, so it's a Jewish non-canonical work. And those of you familiar with the Jewish writings from that period, you know, they wrote ubiquitously on the scriptures, their commentaries and apocalyptic literature and all that. But Lab is one of those histories. It records the begetting ages for the patriarchs before the flood, from Seth to Lamech, and it records the longer chronology. So here's a witness, a snapshot witness from the first century. All right? Now this is important. When I first discovered Lab, I had no knowledge of what Lab was or anything about it, so I had to do a lot of looking into what the experts said about it to see if it would help me in my theory. And so, for example, Louis Feldman, who was just recently died, was a very well-respected scholar of ancient Judaism. He saw Lab as being a Pharisaic work. So a work of the Pharisees, not Egyptian or not Hellenistic, but Pharisaic. And unanimously, the scholarship says that not only that they had the longer numbers, but they were using a Genesis text, a Hebrew text of Genesis. This is fascinating because if the numbers were inflated in the Septuagint, then it has to explain why Lab was using a Hebrew text that looks very much like it had the higher numbers in it. Very fascinating witness Lab is, in my view. And so you can see the numbers. One of the things that makes Lab unique in its witness is it records the remaining years, okay, in Genesis 5. Now, most people in the ancient writings weren't interested in that because that doesn't affect the chronology. What affects the chronology is the begetting age, okay? And then, of course, they were interested in talking about the lifespans because it was so fascinating. How could somebody live to be 900 years old? And they would explain all the reasons why they believed that was the case, the theological argument. But the point is that Lab records the longer chronology. And one of the most important reasons why I believe this supports the witness in Hebrew is because of Lamech's begetting age. You see down here of 182. That is not the number that's in the Septuagint. It's 188. This is the number found in the Masoretic Text. And so this is evidence, in my view, of support for the fact that Lab was written in Hebrew and came from a Hebrew text. And you can see an outline of that in some of these articles that are going to be coming up. Now, the second witness that's extremely important to us is Josephus. Now, usually his numbers on this subject are just dismissed because they say, well, he was just parroting the Septuagint. That's the usual response that you'll see in the literature. But if you look very closely, if one looks very closely, and again, this is another abyss that I was drawn into, because once I started seeing that Josephus was a witness to Genesis 5 and 11, now I had to go understand Josephus scholarship. So you can see that this has taken me down a number of deep rabbit trails, but nonetheless important ones. So here's a couple statements from Josephus, just to give us an overview. The history of the Bible is 5,000 years. I've recorded this. I've translated it from the Hebrew into the Greek. So these are a couple statements. He claimed to use Hebrew text, and the modern scholarship on Josephus, as it relates to Genesis, they all say that he was using a Hebrew text when he was writing about the Pentateuch, and particularly the book of Genesis. And so I'll give you just three examples from well-known Josephus scholars. Henry Thackeray, he died in 1931, still a very well-respected Josephus and Septuagint scholar. Feldman, again, who I just said recently passed away, he documents how Lab and Josephus are closely related at the level of the Hebrew text. Very important for this study. And then the French scholar Naudet, who has looked closely at Josephus' use of the Pentateuch. He believed that the Hebrew text that he was using was very close to the text behind the Septuagint. So you see in the scholarship of Josephus, not that he was using the Septuagint in Genesis, but that he had a Hebrew text. And that means, in my view, that the numbers that he recorded were from a Hebrew text and not the Septuagint text. Now, another important part about this Josephus research has been the very difficult task of looking at the manuscript evidence. Because in the literature, you read all these conflicting opinions about Josephus and what he was using. Josephus was confused in his chronology. He was using both chronologies. He was using the Septuagint. So what I did, I said, I got to put all that aside. I got to find out what the manuscripts say. So fortunately, Thackeray did quite a bit of work on the text critical reconstruction, and then I was able to get a copy of Nice's apparatus in Logos and get to the heart of the matter to see what the manuscript evidence says. And overwhelmingly, I think Thackeray's work and then some refinements show that he was using the longer chronology for sure. Again, just one point that I'll add that's very important. For Lamech, this is very important because the Josephus manuscripts are split on his begetting age, okay? But the lifespan is 707. Now, it looks to me like the 770 digit dropped out in the transmissional history of the Greek. But nonetheless, it was originally 777, which is what's in the Masoretic text. That is not what's in the Septuagint. Septuagint number is different. It's unique. So, in my view, the fact that this lifespan matches the Masoretic is evidence that Josephus was using a Hebrew text. If he was using the Septuagint, he would have recorded 188, and 753 is the lifespan.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. All right. I thought it was 6.
4.
So as we wind down here, and I've not been able to find any witness. Now, conversely, so I went through some of the Septuagint evidence, what I think supports the Septuagint. And I know it's been a boatload of data dumped on you. That's why I gave you those handouts so you can look into it further. There's no external witnesses that testify to the MT's timeline for Genesis 5 and 11 before the 4th century, before Eusebius tabulates them. And so this is important because we have external witnesses to the Genesis text. Everything before the 2nd century is longer chronology. Every single witness. And yet, the MT's numbers are not found until, in a reliable witness, until Eusebius. This is another important consideration as you weigh the arguments. Now, since we're down to 5 minutes, I'm going to skip over this quickly because I do want to talk about archaeology for just a minute. We're in NEAS, right? So, but here's a contradiction in the Masoretic Chronology. Genesis 25:8 says that Abraham was a good old man and he died at 175 years old. In the Masoretic Text, this is contradicted by 4 points. Eber is still alive and more than double that age. Whoop, went the wrong way. Eber, Shem, dies 25 years before Abraham. Noah, 2 years before Abraham's born. And then Genesis 11 indicates that each one of the patriarchs had other sons and daughters, which means all the descendants would have lived to these similar ages. In my view, this is internal evidence that contradicts the statement in Genesis 25:8 and is evidence of deflation in the MT. Okay? It's not consistent internally. So I believe this is an internal argument that shows the MT has been deflated, and the Septuagint is more consistent with that statement. Noah's been dead for centuries, and so on and so on. Okay? So I'm sorry I'm going through that quickly. So let's talk about quickly. First, I believe that the Septuagint chronology the evidence is substantial for its originality. Okay? So I'll let you weigh that argument. So I want to encourage evangelical scholarship to critically re-examine this question. Certainly invite other people to participate in research, critique my viewpoint, want to get it right. But so let's talk about archaeology really fast.
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Okay.
So, 3,300 BC, date of the flood, yielded from the Septuagint. So you've got a number of issues. If you're going to look at the archaeology before Abraham but after the flood, what do you do with that? What do you do with the dates? Here's some big picture stuff you got to consider. First, you got to think about what you think the scope of the flood was and how it would have impacted the archaeological record. So you got to decide exegetically, hermeneutically, historically, scope of the flood and its destructive force, how that impacts archaeological evidence and how you interpret it. So what do you believe about that? Will affect your model. That will affect carbon-14 dating. If the flood is universal, it would have covered the whole planet and buried the whole carbon cycle and messed up the whole carbon-14 cycle. If it's not universal and it's regional, that would change the whole way you look at the carbon-14 dating before the time of Abraham. You've got to put that into your model as you consider it. And then you've got to evaluate the evolutionary paradigm and how the long ages impact this kind of model. Is man the product of slow development, or was he fully mature when he came off the ark and reestablished civilization? This is a key consideration in my view. Think of Tom Hanks being on Castaway Island. He's fully mature, intelligent, image of God, but he's been separated from civilization, and he becomes what? He becomes a caveman. Not because he's a Neanderthal, but because he's been put into a very Neanderthal kind of situation. This is the situation in the post-flood world, if you believe the flood was universal. I'm saying all that as part of the NEAS society to think about, first of all, the interpretation of the Septuagint, the numbers, the date of the flood, and all of these variables that go into looking at the archaeological evidence. Tower of Babel has to be another consideration as you weigh a model for post-flood archaeology, pre-Abrahamic archaeology. And the last consideration is the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. All of those factors have to be taken into account. And I know I crammed that into 3 minutes, so I apologize for that.
And you're out of time.
And I'm out of time. So do we have time for questions or no?
Maybe one or two
One or two. So I'm sorry, I overdid it. Yeah, big question on the MT's deflation. Read our general theory on that in the Bible and Spade article that I handed out. It has to do with Messianic chronology, and I'll leave it at that.